The detective's knuckles hit my front door 3 times. I remember the sound as if it were a metronome, marking the moment my life split into before and after. I moved slowly across the kitchen, my slippers muffling on the linoleum, peered through the peephole, and there he was, a uniformed man, badge catching a thin strip of Ohio winter light, his breath fogging in the cold. He looked at me with the kind of patience people reserve for strangers who have lost their balance. "My name's Detective Morrison," he said when I opened the door. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held out a folded card like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "May I come in?" Standing there, I realized how ordinary everything had seemed until that knock, how ordinary the small rituals of my days had been. The kettle warming itself on the stove, my husband George's old armchair by the window where he used to read the Tribune, the stack of unpaid bills I kept promising I'd sort out. Ordinary, safe, then a badge and a polite voice. I invited him in. I offered him coffee because that is what we did in Ohio. We offer coffee. He took the cup, sat at my kitchen table, and looked at me like someone who'd read more than one sad story, but wanted to make sure this one was told straight. "This isn't easy to say," he began, and for a second I thought he was apologizing for visiting. He wasn't. He was starting a story he intended to follow to its ends. He said the words like he'd walked them across a lot of kitchen tables before. "We have some concerns about documents that were recently signed in your name." I don't know why, but the thought that someone might be signing things for me felt almost absurd, like a scene from a faraway movie. "I'm Catherine Patterson. I'm 72. I live in a modest ranch house on a quiet street in Ohio. I used to make bread every Sunday and leave a plate on the counter for the neighbors. I taught David how to tie his shoes and later how to balance a checkbook. I was married to George for 48 years. When he died, the house itched with absence. Grief leaves a room that needs filling, and people walk into that space sometimes with good intentions and sometimes with their own agendas." I told Detective Morrison all that. He listened, took notes, and then very gently asked about a woman named Melissa. "She comes around here," I said. "She's married to my son, David. Melissa is, well, she was always so helpful. She used to bring lemon cookies, my favorite, and she'd call to check on me. She and David were so attentive after George passed. I didn't think a thing of it. That's one of the hardest things to admit, how easy it is to trust somebody who appears to love your family. The wedge that grief drives is not always cruel. Sometimes it just leaves you with fewer hands to carry the load. Melissa seemed like one of those hands. She would dust the mantle, trim my roses, and tell me, 'Leave it, Catherine.
We'll take care of it.' People said she had a head for numbers. She worked as an accountant, and that made me feel secure. I liked that. I liked the idea of someone who could help balance the practical parts of my life when my hands still trembled with those first months of widowhood. The wedding was small. David and Melissa had said their vows in the old church where George and I had been married. They stood in front of the same oak altar, smiling in a way that made my chest feel full and tender. Melissa wore a simple dress. David looked at her like a man who'd finally come home. We took pictures in the garden, George's roses, a picture of my son rubbing the back of his neck like he'd done since he was a kid. Everything was right. For months, everything looked right. Melissa called every Sunday. She brought cookies, and sometimes she'd come and bring soup and the kind of sympathy that arrives in casseroles and practicality. She helped me sort through the mail. She fixed things I didn't have the strength to tackle. She was there at the appointments I was too weary to make on my own. For a while, I was grateful in a way that made me trust her implicitly. The first thing that made me feel uneasy was small. It should have been small. It was not dramatic. A tone in her voice. The way she'd ask about my bank statements as if she were checking the weather. "Catherine," she would say with that soft accountant's cadence, "do you keep everything in one place? I could help you organize it." It was a practical offer. I accepted because it felt easier than refusing. Then those questions multiplied and got sharper. "Do you have a living trust?" she asked once, peering over the edge of a newspaper as I stirred my tea. "Who's on your accounts?" Another time she told me about a conversation with a bank manager. Oh, Mr. Rodriguez was so helpful, and how easy it would be to move things along with the right paperwork. She always framed it as help. She said things like, "We can check these boxes for you," or "I'll make sure nothing burdens you." She never said, "I could take this," or "I could make decisions without you." Not in so many words. What I didn't notice at first was the pattern, the way helpfulness started aligning itself with access. Melissa's presence in my study became less guest-like and more proprietorial. She began to show up unannounced, which I shrugged off because who wants to be fussy about company? She'd go straight to the desk where I kept important papers, lift the corner of a folder as if checking the weather, and leave it slightly rearranged. Once, she asked me if I ever traveled, and when I said not much, commented that having a power of attorney would make things easier if I ever wanted to change. The first time I found a document I didn't recognize, I thought perhaps it was a draft. It was a form tucked in the back of my study drawer, a power of attorney, with language I didn't quite understand.
The signature across the bottom looked like mine at a glance. I frowned. My name was there. That was the moment I should have called someone. Instead, I told myself I was tired and that maybe I'd signed it and forgotten. Grief does odd things to memory. Then my friend Patricia came over. Patricia and I have been neighbors for 30 years. She calls me Kat and brings over the kind of judge-free company old friends provide. She lives nearby and knows how I keep my papers, folders labeled in tidy pen, everything in its place. When she noticed that the drawer had been disturbed, she frowned in the way that good friends frown. "You sure someone hasn't been here when you weren't looking?" she asked, and I said no because it embarrassed me to think someone might be rifling through my things. She pressed, and finally I told her about the form. Her look was not dramatic, it was practical, the look people who have lost first husbands and seen the world turn on its hinges give. "Have you compared that signature to a check?" she said. I had not. The idea that I would have to prove my own signature felt strange and humiliating, but Patricia didn't judge. She sat down at my kitchen table, and together we pulled out a stack of old canceled checks, credit card statements, greeting cards, anything with my handwriting. When I held them side by side, my fingers trembled. On the form labeled Power of Attorney, the loops and hips of the letters looked like mine if you squinted, but the little flourish on the lowercase t, my usual habit, didn't match. The line that usually slants up at the end of my N was flat. The differences were small, but they were there, and they were deliberate. "This is forgery," Patricia said quietly. It was a word that sank like a stone. I could have confronted Melissa then. I could have marched down to her house and demanded to know why my signature was on a document I'd never authorized. I thought about calling David. I even called his number and listened to it ring and then went to voicemail. There's a particular kind of silence that follows grief. You think you know what to do, and then every step feels like a test you weren't prepared for. Instead, I did the thing my best friend told me to do. I didn't say anything to the family. I sorted through my papers and photographed everything. I made copies of the document with the signature and began a small journal. Each entry recorded a call, a visit, a strange remark. I wrote down dates, times, and little things Melissa had said, statements that alone might mean nothing, but collected together like pebbles could create a dam. When you're 72, the idea of fighting a member of your family feels unthinkable. What happens if you make a wrong move and lose the rest of what you have? But there's also a fierce clarity that grief can bring, the understanding that you are the steward of your life, and that passivity will cost you. I wanted to protect what George and I had built. I wanted to maintain the dignity of a home where I could brew tea and answer my own mail. I found Marcus Chen by recommendation, an elder law attorney with a steady reputation and a gentle manner. On the phone, he listened like a friend and then said, "Bring everything you have. We'll look at it together." His office was airy. He offered me water and a cushion for my back. He didn't roll his eyes at the word forgery. He didn't say it flippantly. He said, "We'll document it. We'll see if the signature is legitimate. We'll contact the bank. We'll take measured steps." Those words felt like armor, not because I trusted the law to be swift. That's another falsehood people like to bandy about, but because I needed someone who would treat my paperwork like evidence and not like a family quarrel. Marcus advised caution and thoroughness. People who take advantage of elders often rely on secrecy and the assumption that relatives won't notice. "You're doing the right thing by keeping a record," he said. So I began to set small traps, not out of malice, but out of necessity. I changed the locks on my back door one Saturday afternoon when I felt particularly unnerved. The locksmith was a young man who made small, sympathetic noises when I explained why I wanted it done. I didn't call David. I didn't tell Melissa. The house felt different with the new click of a secure deadbolt. Safer, yes, but also a little lonelier, as if I had drawn a line I couldn't easily erase. I installed a small camera in the study, a little eye that watched the door from the bookshelf. I told myself it was only temporary, that this was about accountability, about being able to say definitively what had happened and when. The camera made the room into a record. It watched the corner where the desk sat, the drawer where I kept the important papers, the little brass lamp George loved. There was a comfort to knowing the camera would catch movement. There was a sharper comfort in being able to show not just a memory, but a sequence of events. A person entering, a hand rifling through a drawer, a folder tugged out and skimmed. I kept writing in my journal. I recorded the date Melissa came by the house and sat in my kitchen and casually brought up the subject of moving funds to a joint account. I wrote down the way she laughed at something David said on the phone, a laugh that had always sounded genuine, but now landed differently in my ears. I logged bank visits I made with Marcus, the exchanges with Mr. Rodriguez at the bank. "We'll place a flag on the account," he told Marcus, his voice clipped and professional, and the sense that others were beginning to see the same pattern I had noticed. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about the wedding photos, the way Melissa had smiled for the camera in George's garden. I would trace the edges of those images with my imagination. What was kindness and what was calculation?
I didn't want to believe the worst because the prospect of believing it felt like betrayal of the life I had built with George and of the son I loved. David and I had been so close. He used to call me every Sunday after church, and those calls had been our small ritual of connection. When he started missing some of them, I blamed his work or the stress of a new marriage. I did not want to imagine he would side with anything that would harm me. And yet, the things Melissa did suggested someone more interested in paperwork than in a widow's company. There were signs, small and stubborn. I found a canceled check from months earlier that had been altered, numbers smudged, the memo line changed. The sums weren't huge at first. They were subtle deductions that could be mistaken as bank errors or my own forgetfulness. But when you look at a series of little disappearances, they become a map, where the money went, who benefited, and how it was done. Marcus explained this in terms that were useful but not surprising. People who commit financial exploitation often start small to test the waters. If the victim doesn't challenge the initial transgression, they escalate. Hearing that was both an instruction and a revelation. It told me what I had suspected but didn't want to name. It also made me angry in a way grief had softened. I was angry not at being targeted, but at the way my vulnerability had been read like an instruction manual. I had expected, rightly or not, that family would be the last place for predation. I did not rush to moralize David. My son is not a simple character in a novel. He is a man who loves his mother, and who in many ways has been caught in the middle of decisions he did not fully understand. I quote him to myself, as if wanting his voice to temper my anger. "Mom, I thought she was helping." I could hear the confusion in his words when I finally spoke to him, the way he hawked and swallowed his own defenses. He told me he had trusted Melissa because she was reliable and seemed to care. I wanted to believe him. I still do in ways that ache, but trust without scrutiny becomes a weakness when papers are involved. The week I found the amended check, I went to the bank. I met Mr. Rodriguez in a small private room with frosted glass. He was calm and practical, the sort of person who works at a bank and has learned how to say sensitive things in neutral terms. He asked a few questions, requested documentation, and recommended that we freeze certain transactions while an investigation took place. That felt like progress. It felt like a guardrail around something that had been allowed to drift dangerously close to the cliff's edge. At home, the house hummed with a different energy. The camera on the bookshelf blinked its steady right. I taped my journal entries inside a folder and labeled it with a thick black marker, "For Police." The act of labeling felt both ridiculous and necessary.
It was my way of saying, I will not let this be swept under a rug. I will not let somebody else tell me my memory is failing, when in fact, someone else was taking things without my consent. I spent a Sunday afternoon going through old greeting cards and comparing handwriting. Each small difference was a clue, a curve on an R that didn't belong, the loop of a Y where it should be straight. I did not know at the time how much weight handwriting analysis could carry in a legal setting, but I knew enough to understand that evidence is often a mosaic, a collection of small corroborating pieces that together reveal the whole. I am not a paranoid woman. I am a woman who had loved and who believed in the usual decencies of family, yet nothing about this felt usual anymore. Help had turned to access, and access had turned to an attempt to make decisions for me. The power of attorney form was not a single isolated sheet. It was a key. Whoever held it could unlock bank accounts, make sales, and steer an estate. That was not a risk I was willing to take. There were moments when I thought of confronting Melissa directly. I rehearsed phrases in my head, calm things that a reasonable person would say, but I worried about how the conversation could go wrong. Would she take it as an accusation and become defensive? Would she bring evidence I hadn't seen? What if confronting her pushed her to take more immediate action? Marcus had urged caution. He had said, "Let's document, pause, and then move in a manner that preserves your rights and safety." That sounded sensible, and so I followed his counsel. The more I documented, the more the picture clarified. Melissa's visits had a rhythm. Show up, make a friendly remark about your mental sharpness, suggest professionalization of affairs. It was a pattern that smelled of something rehearsed, and yet there were moments that suggested genuine complexity. When she sat in my kitchen and cried at the mention of George, or when she told me David was stressed at work. People are rarely all good or all bad, and my entire life told me to see shades. That's why this hurt so much, because betrayal wrapped itself in tenderness. There are small domestic details that have stayed with me. The pale blue china cup Melissa once left on my counter with a sugar cookie beside it. The way she tied back her hair when she was concentrating on paperwork at my desk. The sound of her heels on my porch when she left in a hurry. Memory keeps these things because they are the currency of ordinary days, and ordinary days are what predators exploit. They find the grooves where trust lives and press against them until something gives. One afternoon, Melissa came over with a slim folder and set it gently on the kitchen table, as if it were a serving tray. "Just some paperwork to make things easier," she said, smiling that same precise smile from the wedding photos. I looked down at the papers and felt the old knot in my stomach return.
Inside were pre-filled forms, documents that would empower someone to make decisions on my behalf. There was a typewritten sentence that began, "I, Catherine M. Patterson, hereby appoint," and after it, a signature that could fool an eye that wasn't searching. She offered to stay while I read them, watched me with a calmness that felt like a performance. She suggested things I didn't need, selling the house, moving funds to a joint account so we can manage it without burdening you. She used that word burden like a soft blade. When I looked up, she was already mid-sentence, anticipating my questions and answering them as if we'd rehearsed this together. I did not sign. I set the folder aside, told her I needed to think about it. She nodded in a way that was both understanding and slightly impatient, as if she expected a predictable answer. When she left, she hugged me and said, "You know I only want what's best for you." I believed her because I wanted to, and because old habits of trust die slowly. That night, I put the folder in the drawer and called Marcus. His voice across the line was steady. "Bring it in," he said. "Let's compare that signature again. We'll document the differences." We did, and when the samples were placed side by side, the forgery was no longer a suspicion, but a pattern. There was a tremor of vindication and humiliation at once. Finding out you've been forged is a peculiar kind of betrayal, because it is both intimate and mechanical. A signature is a private thing, a small curve of ink that says, "Yes, this belongs to me." To see that curve duplicated without you is to feel an interior theft. It is also a crime that is quiet in its cruelty. No broken glass, no raised voices, just a few letters altered until the truth wears someone else's face. Marcus said we should involve the police. He did not speak with the sharp certainty of a crusader. He spoke with a sober sense of someone who had seen this before and knew the best path was to collect evidence and then let the state decide. Detective Morrison's visit was the beginning of that path, and when he left my kitchen that day, he promised to look into the documents and to meet me at the bank. It's strange how the world rearranges itself in the presence of an investigation. Everything becomes more serious. Casual words gather weight. The phone calls I'd shrug off began to feel like clues. Visits from Melissa were suddenly recorded in my journal with the same gravity I used to reserve for anniversaries and birthdays. The camera's grainy eye kept watch, and I found myself breathing easier knowing that movements in my study would not be invisible anymore. I don't relish thinking of my life as a list of things to secure. I love my roses and my bridge club and the quiet of an evening spent with a book and a cup of tea.
But there was a determination growing in me, steady as a pulse. I would not be stripped of my autonomy because I had loved and because my husband's chair still smelled faintly of his tobacco. I would not let a document signed in my name without my consent determine the fate of a life I had built. So I prepared, not because I wanted a war, but because I owed it to myself and to George's memory to be vigilant. I printed copies of everything. I labeled folders. I backed up the videos from the small camera.
I placed sticky notes on the drawer that contained the important papers and signed my name on several items in ways I would later use as verification. It felt tedious and necessary. Each precaution felt like a small act of self-respect. There are nights when I find myself looking at the wedding photo with both pride and sorrow. David stands there, younger, proud, oblivious perhaps to the strain the years would place between us. I love him. I do not want to think of him as a perpetrator. I want to think of him as my son who made an honest choice to marry a woman who seemed kind. But love does not preclude responsibility. That is what I have had to learn as I age. You can love someone and still hold them to account when they cross a line. The house began to feel like a place under gentle surveillance. My surveillance, but necessary surveillance. The kind that a widow who has been betrayed learns to use as a shield rather than a weapon. I kept attending my bridge club meetings. I kept tending the roses. I kept baking lemon cookies on Sundays and leaving a plate for Patricia because ritual kept me human. At the same time, I continued to gather evidence, to speak to Marcus, to coordinate with the bank, and to answer Detective Morrison's patient questions. There were small victories. The bank put a temporary flag on my accounts. Mr. Rodriguez, ever so pragmatic, found a few irregular transactions that, though small, were enough to corroborate a pattern. Each tiny confirmation made me feel less alone in my conviction. It was not simply paranoia. It was a documented consistency of strange things adding up. And yet the hardest part was not putting together the puzzle. It was deciding that I would pursue consequences. There is a moral complexity to taking legal action against a member of your family. I sat many nights with that complexity like a stone in my chest. I thought about mercy and justice. I thought about the words a judge might say, and about the quiet of a jail cell. I did not want to be punitive for its own sake. I wanted to prevent further harm, to me and to others. When Detective Morrison left that first afternoon, he told me he'd be in touch. He didn't promise results. He never did. That was what I appreciated. He didn't make me believe in a certainty the justice system rarely guarantees. He promised to follow where the evidence led. That was enough to set the wheels in motion.
Now, as I sit at the kitchen table and think back on those early days, I can see the precise moment my life split. It was not the day Melissa brought over the folder or the day George's chair grew cold. It was the day I decided to catalog the small things. Cookie crumbs, a changed lock, a camera's grainy footage, a signature that did not belong. It was the day I chose documentation over confrontation and patience over an emotional rush. I don't tell this as a boast. I tell it because someone has to remind the rest of us that old age doesn't mean helplessness. There is dignity in noticing and courage in cataloging. There is also the quiet work of reconciling a son you love with actions that harmed you. That reconciliation would not be easy. I don't have all the answers, and I won't pretend the path ahead is simple. For now, the house is quieter. The new lock clicks with finality. The camera keeps watch on the study. The folder labeled "For Police" sits in a drawer where I can reach it without rifling. I make tea and stir until the spoon ticks against the side of the cup. I look at the wedding photo and let the grief find its place, without letting it become my only story. If this story is something you feel might help someone you know, an aging parent, a neighbor, a friend, please share it. So many of these things hide in the tidy corners of daily life, and the more we speak about them, the less sharp their edges become. There are more steps to tell: how the bank records began to match the journal, how Detective Morrison and Marcus worked together to map the transactions, the way Melissa's demeanor changed when I began to document interactions. There's the day I discovered more than one altered document, and the slow dawning that this was not a one-time mistake. But those are chapters for the next sitting. Right now, in the quiet of my Ohio kitchen, I make one simple promise to myself. I will not sign anything I did not authorize. I will not allow a neat smile and a well-pressed folder to determine the fate of my life. Outside, the neighbor's dog barked, then stopped. The kettle hummed. I turned the page in my journal and began to write the next entries. Dates, times, small phrases, everything in ink that could not be rewritten by anyone else. The next weeks moved with a strange, deliberate rhythm, an odd mixture of small domestic routines and the cold arithmetic of an investigation. Marcus and Detective Morrison talked on my behalf. I answered their questions, signed forms,
and watched my quiet life become paperwork. Each new document was both a scar and a protection. It felt odd to think of a life I had lived in the round, roses, bread, church, reduced in part to grids and logs. Yet that reduction was what would prove the line between what belonged to me and what had been taken. Mr. Rodriguez at the bank was careful, but not theatrical.
He showed me copies of transactions that, when laid out side by side with my journal entries, looked less like accidents and more like a map. Tiny withdrawals here, a transfer there, a joint account opened under the guise of convenience. Small choices that, in aggregate, began to look intentional. He never waved his hands. He simply placed the records on the table and said, "This matches Miss Patterson's timeline." Those were small, practical words that felt huge to me. Detective Morrison came over again, this time with a plain notebook and a patient face. "We'll need you to do two things, Catherine," he said, as if reciting something careful and kind. "Keep documenting and stay predictable. If we can establish a pattern, it helps." He didn't tell me how the law would move or promise outcomes. He talked instead about steps, getting handwriting experts involved, preserving the camera footage, coordinating with the bank to limit access, and said, "We'll put together a clear record." The handwriting expert was a woman with steady hands and the sort of patience that only comes from repetition. She sat at my kitchen table and compared signatures until the light in the room seemed to thin. "There are consistencies in your handwriting," she explained, "and consistent anomalies in the question signature." She didn't mince words. She walked me through how small shifts, how an ink stroke begins, how pressure changes, create patterns. When she said the word forgery, it landed differently this time. It had the weight of proof, not just intuition. Melissa's behavior shifted in subtle ways as well. At first, she continued to appear concerned, calls in the morning to ask if I'd slept well, or sudden offers to come over for just a minute. But as the bank placed blocks and the camera quietly watched, the friendliness frayed. She asked more pointed questions about whether I was seeing professionals and suggested a doctor might recommend certain things. She brought up, with odd timing, the subject of downsizing and how hard it was for elderly people to make decisions. Once, when she thought I wasn't looking, she slid a hand across a family photo on the mantel as if rearranging my attachments. I learned to watch the quiet things, the way someone pressed a teacup down, the hesitation before answering a question, the quick glance at a drawer as if memorizing its contents. Those little habits, once observed, became part of the case. They were, in their own small way, witnesses. There was a day I will remember for its ordinariness, a gray March afternoon, the kind of Ohio sky that hangs like a sheet. Melissa came over, ostensibly to take me to a doctor's appointment I had not asked for. She said she was concerned about my driving. I declined. I'd always driven when I wanted to, and I liked the small independence of it. She pouted a little and left, but she was gone no more than an hour. When I went to the study later, a thin envelope sat on the desk. Inside was a photocopy of the power of attorney form she had once brought over, this time annotated in a careful hand, dates circled, names underlined. It felt like a message. I am paying attention. That same day, Marcus called with an update from the prosecutor's office. He used the term "we," as if the law were a collective effort, and said they had received the handwriting report and would like to speak with me. Detective Morrison came to the house then, sat again at my kitchen table, and said we're ready to attempt to preserve evidence that might show a direct attempt to use the forged document. He laid out a plan that was measured and humane. A meeting arranged under the pretext of discussing more paperwork, a recorder disguised as a small handheld device, and officers nearby but not visible. I felt my palms go damp. The idea of orchestrating a moment designed to catch someone felt almost theatrical, but it was necessary. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday. Marcus and Detective Morrison sat in the car across the street. Mr. Rodriguez had arranged for a bank representative to be on call. Patricia stopped by early that morning to bring me bread. She sat with me while I dressed and smoothed the front of my sweater with small, practical motions. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." Melissa arrived right on time, her hair pulled back in its usual tidy curl, a small leather folder in her hand. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. She placed the folder down with the soft, careful manner of someone handling fragile china. "Just some things to go over," she said. "Nothing to worry about, Kat." For a short while, she spoke in the smooth voice of a woman who had always been convincing. She reviewed pages, asked about bank names, and then, almost as an aside, mentioned how much easier it would be if she had access to my accounts to help manage things while you recover. I felt something tighten inside me,
a muscle I had not known I still had. I kept my voice steady. "I've asked you repeatedly to let me decide things for myself," I said. "I appreciate the offers, Melissa, but I want to be involved." She smiled in a way that had, in earlier months, comforted me. Now the smile felt rehearsed. Her hands were steady. She reached into her folder and, with a casual motion, opened it as if to show me something. That was the cue. The recorder under the sugar bowl clicked on. The camera in the study, angled just so, caught the light that crossed her hair as she moved. What Melissa said next was the moment the months of documentation converged into an event. She told me a story about how banks sometimes insisted on a certain formality, about how it saved time to have a power of attorney in place. She leaned forward and said, "You know, if you had signed those forms, we could make decisions faster. You wouldn't have to fuss about writing checks." Her tone was casual, helpful in its phrasing.
She spoke as if the idea of signing now was simply a continuation of past kindnesses. When she reached for a pen and rested it lightly on the edge of the paper, I felt cold. I did not move. I had no intention of signing. I'd rehearsed that. I kept my hands folded on my lap and said, "Melissa, I am not signing anything today." The way she blinked, slow, surprised, was almost a performance. "Oh," she said, and for the first time the mask cracked. She pressed the point of the pen to the table and adjusted the paperwork, as if to suggest that the next step was inevitable, that my resistance was a small theater of discontent. Detective Morrison walked in from the kitchen doorway then, quiet, unassuming, the badge at his belt. Melissa's face shifted. For a moment there was a flurry of words, an insistence that this was just paperwork, and a quick apology for any misunderstanding. The officers moved gently. No one shouted, no one raised a fist. They explained that they were there on suspicion of forgery and fraud, and that Miranda rights would be given, but those legal phrases were background noise to me. I felt a peculiar combination of sorrow and relief. When Melissa was led away, her composure unraveled in small, private ways. She kept saying, "I was just trying to help," like a prayer repeated to steady herself. Her hands shook when the officers cuffed her, and once, as she passed me on the stairs, she darted her eyes to David's wedding photo and whispered something I did not catch. I felt my own throat tighten, not with triumph, but with grief at what had become of our family. The arrest was not the end. It was a beginning of a public and legal thing that felt both cleansing and draining. In the days that followed, more documents surfaced. Bank statements showed transfers into an account that had once been jointed, subtly. Checks were found with altered amounts, and a cashier's check appeared, one I did not recognize, made out to a name I had seen before in Melissa's handwriting on a ledger. Marcus navigated the paperwork with a steadiness that studied me. He explained that the prosecutor would decide on charges, and that plea negotiations were common. He did not make promises. He said facts and timelines. When charges were filed, they were the plain labels of wrongdoing: forgery, identity theft, fraud, terms that fit the behavior without being melodramatic. I was called to provide a victim impact statement. Preparing that statement required summoning a part of myself that had been both injured and practical. I did not want to be vindictive. I wanted to be honest. In court, I spoke with a voice that surprised me by its steadiness. "I am 72, I said. "I have lived my life with small rituals that make it whole. Bread on Sundays, cards with friends, the smell of my husband's old jacket. The theft was of money, yes, but it was also of trust. You do not understand fully, I think, if you haven't lost the small things that make a house a home."
There is a weight to that. It is not about being paid back entirely. It is about knowing the boundary was respected. I do not wish cruelty upon Melissa. I wish accountability so that others might be spared this kind of quiet taking. Later, Detective Morrison came to my house with a soft look. "You did the right thing," he said. It was a phrase he must have said to many, but it landed with warmth. "You made a difference beyond your case. We've seen similar patterns in other calls." He didn't say we would recover everything. He didn't promise perfect justice. He merely acknowledged the moral value of what I had done. Melissa's plea was negotiated. The prosecutor and defense reached a resolution that acknowledged her actions while allowing for certain terms that were standard in such cases: a term of incarceration, probation, and ordered restitution. Restitution was the part that tasted of compromise. The judge spoke about harm and deterrence, and finally pronounced a sentence that would include time behind bars and a requirement to repay some of what had been taken. Everyone understood, in the hush that followed, that restitution often falls short. Money dissipates, accounts are closed,
and not all losses can be repaired. The sentence, though meaningful, could not stitch back the particular intimacy that had been violated. Family consequences were complex and slow. David stood at the periphery for much of the legal process, not as a defendant, but as a son caught between loyalties. We met, slowly and with discomfort. He was in shock for a while. The first time we sat across from one another after everything began, he said, "I didn't know." His eyes were wet, and his voice trailed. He was, in many ways, a man who had trusted the person he married. I told him I believed he had been sincere when he said he had thought she was helping. But I told him, gently, that trust without oversight had created a space where harm could happen. He agreed to counseling. He spoke to Detective Morrison when called, and he cooperated with the investigation as best he could. Our reconciliation was not cinematic. It was a series of small, honest acts, phone calls that became regular again, a weekly dinner where we avoided the heavy topics at first, and then gradually allowed ourselves to reflect on what had happened. David started attending therapy. He had to reckon with choices he'd made out of convenience or assumption. I had to reckon with my own judgment about his marriage. There were moments of tenderness, him bringing a casserole, me showing him how to prune a rosebush the way George had taught me. There were also difficult conversations about boundaries and about how I wanted my independence maintained. Melissa's absence from our daily lives was a grief on its own terms. There were no dramatic scenes beyond the courtroom. There was instead an empty space at the holidays where a voice once filled the room. I felt sadness for a person I had once trusted.
It is possible to be angry and still sorrowful. Grief, in the end, is not a single emotion. There were practical outcomes as well. The bank reversed some transactions where evidence was clear. Some accounts were closed. A small portion of funds was recovered through restitution orders, though much of it was gone. Marcus reminded me, repeatedly and gently, that the goal was not only to recover money, but to set a precedent, showing that elder exploitation is noticed, investigated, and prosecuted. He spoke about deterrence and community responsibility. Those were larger concepts than my house or my checks, but they had meaning. Perhaps the act of bringing this into daylight would make another person think twice before crossing a line. The courtroom exchanges, the evidence, the plea, it all left marks. But slowly, life knitted itself into a new pattern. I resumed routines that had nothing to do with litigation. I tended the roses, though I did not prune them as precisely as George had. I returned to bridge club and to the small volunteer hours I kept at the library. I found a certain joy in trivialities, the crispness of a new loaf, the way light passes across the table in the afternoon, the steady, ordinary sound of someone turning a page. One of the unexpected parts of this process was how many people reached out. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers offered condolences and support, or more pragmatically, advice and referrals. A woman from the church brought over a list of elder lawyers and local support groups. Another neighbor volunteered to check in every Wednesday afternoon. These small networks were a kind of balm. They reminded me that while the betrayal had been personal, the response could be communal. I did not become harsher toward people. I became more cautious. I learned to ask questions without sounding accusatory. I learned to protect my papers and to keep certain things in my own control. I also learned the value of trusted advisors, people like Marcus who could help translate confusion into strategy. That pragmatism did not make me less warm. It made my warmth a choice rather than an unquestioned assault. There were also moments of reconnection with David that felt like tiny recoveries. One autumn evening, months after the trial, we sat on the back porch with mugs of tea while the sun sank low over the neighbors' maples. The conversation turned inevitably to the past, to George, to the small rituals we had kept, and to the ways we were learning to be careful with one another's affections. David reached across the little wooden table, placed his hand over mine, and said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for not seeing it." I forgave him. Not because the hurt had evaporated, but because love does not always end with one betrayal. Forgiveness, in my case, was a way to keep part of my life light. I began to speak, when asked, to small groups about what had happened. Not to sensationalize, but to inform.
I would say at the start, I am not a lawyer. I am not an expert. I am a woman who kept a journal and was refused the small indignity of being made invisible. I would describe signs to watch for: the casual interest in paperwork, the repeated offers to help that come with pressure, the way questions about bank accounts or decisions escalate into an inferno of access. People listened with the rapt attention I might once have afforded to sermons. Sometimes hands would reach across tables. Sometimes someone would cry quietly. There was power, I learned, in speaking the quiet things aloud. When people ask me what I might have done differently, I never pretend I have a perfect list. I might have been quicker to compare signatures when I first noticed the form. I might have opened the photo album to a different page and looked closer at small interactions. But I also know that self-blame is less useful than preparedness. The truth is, in the immediate months after George died, my attention was scattered, and that scatter can be exploited. Being older does not mean being helpless. It means perhaps being wiser in certain ways and more in need of community in others. I want to say something to children of aging parents. Visit more than you think necessary. Ask to see their financial statements, not with suspicion, but with care. And to older folks, you have a lifetime of skills and intuition. Use them. If something feels off, treat it as a fact to be investigated, not simply a discomfort to be endured. There were practical adjustments I made around the house. I kept my important papers in a small locked safe tied to a code only I knew. I updated my emergency contacts at the bank to include Mr. Rodriguez and another trusted neighbor. I made sure that my attorney was someone I trusted and that my son knew who that person was. These changes did not make me fearful. They made me resilient. Months passed. Melissa served time. The restitution paid a part of what had been taken. She wrote a letter, one of those things that make your stomach drop and then ache, apologizing and asking for understanding. I read it, folded it, and put it with the other court documents. There was sorrow in the lines, yes, but there was also an acceptance of the consequences. I did not gloat. I did not want to be cruel. There was a human being there who had done wrong and who would now live with the results. That felt enough. My son and I rebuilt in the way that broken things sometimes mend, carefully, with stitches you can see. We learned to ask questions of one another without assuming malice. There were new rituals, a monthly museum trip, an extra phone call on Thursdays when he knew my bridge night ended. These acts of ordinary tenderness mattered. The final chapters of this story are quieter than the arrest and the courtroom. They are in the small reclaiming of routine. I hang the same curtains I always have. I let the roses grow a little wild.
I bake lemon cookies on Sundays and leave a plate by the gate for those who might pass. When I look at the wedding photo now, I feel a complex blend of love, sorrow, and a kind of hard-won peace. If you are watching this and you think you or someone you love might be at risk, there are steps you can take. Talk to a trusted attorney, contact your bank and ask for safeguards, and consider filing a report with Adult Protective Services in your state. You do not have to handle this alone. If you're not sure where to start, contact your local Adult Protective Services or the National Elder Abuse Hotline for guidance. Communities can help protect the dignity and independence of their elders. Before I close, a word about courage. It is not always loud. My courage in this was a series of small, quiet choices: locking a door, installing a camera, keeping a journal, and asking for help. Courage looked like patience sometimes, and at other times it looked like a stubborn refusal to sign papers I did not understand. It looked like calling a lawyer and letting professionals do what they do best. I have told you this story because if one person watching learns to notice the small things, then these months of paperwork and hospital visits and legal forms will have changed more than my life. They will have changed a community. They will have saved someone else a portion of the sorrow I felt. When Melissa once said, smiling in the soft way that had once calmed me, "She'll sign anything," I could have believed the words, or I could have refused them. I refused. I recorded, I documented, I asked professionals, and I asked for help. I asked for accountability, not out of vengeance, but out of the hope that my life could remain mine and that someone else's bright smile would not be a cloak for harm. This house in Ohio is home again in the ways that matter most. The kettle still hisses, the roses still bloom in a wild, unbothered way. The bridge club meets on Thursdays, and sometimes we laugh loud enough to wake the neighbors. David and I sit on the porch in the late afternoons and talk about trivial things. Sometimes we remember George, and sometimes we do not mention him at all, which is, in its way, also a kind of grace. If this story has touched you, please consider sharing it with someone caring for an elderly parent or neighbor. Tell them to watch for the small things: paperwork that appears folded into conversation, 2 earnest offers to help, pressure wrapped in kindness. If you need resources, please reach out to your local adult protective services or a trusted elder law attorney. You can also find guidance through national support organizations that help victims of elder financial abuse. If you've stayed with me through these words, I thank you. There is dignity in attention and strength in quiet persistence. I keep my journal tucked in a drawer, labeled in thick black ink, for police.
It remains there as a testament not to bitterness, but to care. Care for the home George and I built, and care for the idea that aging need not mean surrender. They said, "She'll sign anything." They were wrong.